What's the difference between Christ and Elijah, since they are both alive in heaven?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, because I'm not sure who the they are that's telling you this, that, and the other thing. So I don't really know the background of these assertions or statements. But understand this, that when we talk about the prophets who've gone on before us, the apostles that have gone on before us, that all these things that happen, that we know that God is the God of the living. See, this is a very interesting thing, that when Jesus is questioned, of course, like he always was, about what he was teaching, and people are trying to trick him into saying the wrong thing so that they could condemn him as blasphemy and all these things, that they try to trick him into saying things like, well, what about this, or what about that, or what about this, or what about the other thing? But when Jesus talks, Jesus assures us that God is the God of the living. Okay, now this is very interesting, because you had the Pharisees, who were one section of a group of believers and teachers, and then you had the Sadducees, which were another section and group of believers. And you had, of course, the Leviticus priests. You also had the Herodians, those who were trying to make the middle ground between Greek culture and true culture that is tied to the biblical scriptures of what the prophets taught. And so you'd have these people come and question Jesus. And one time you have the Sadducees coming and question Jesus about the resurrection of the body, and that there would actually be those who live. Well, you see, the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection of the body. Okay? The Sadducees are sad, you see, because they have no hope in the resurrection. They think, the Sadducees taught, that all we have is this life. When you die, the game is over, and that's it, and it doesn't matter no more. That's it. It's all over. But what Jesus taught, as what the Scriptures taught, is that there is the hope in the resurrection, that there is the hope in the life to come, and Jesus himself is the hope that we have in the life to come. And so when they question Jesus, they say, oh, well, Moses never taught this, that this was something taught later on. Jesus takes them right back to the very words of Moses and says, haven't you ever read that God is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? In other words, what Jesus is trying to teach us is that it would be incorrect to say that at one time he was the God of Abraham, and then Abraham died, so he's no longer Abraham's God. And then at one time he was the God of Isaac, but Isaac died, and so he's no longer Isaac's God. And same thing with Jacob. Instead, what Jesus is teaching us in this very simple, profound confession of faith in the Old Testament, that we rejoice in the same God who gives promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the same God who reveals himself at the burning bush to Moses, the same God who gives the promise to David. This is the God of the living. And so Jesus will teach us that when we confess that we believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses and David, it means that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and David are still living. that he is the God of the living, not the God of the dead. You see, for there's life in him. Now, I think that one of the problems that we run into is we try to look at these spiritual realities from this earthly realm. And so we try to make sense of these things here on earth, and trying to make sense of heaven, and trying to like peek in as if we had a long ladder that we could climb all the way up into the sky and look and get a peek of what's going on. And so it's problematic in trying to make sense of all this, because we are confined to time. There's a day that we're born, there's a day that we die, and that's a time frame that we work with, a beginning and an end. But with God, everything's eternal. With God, there is no time. And so that we understand that in this life, we are confined to time. But when we die, like for instance, the thief on the cross, you have the two thieves on the cross with Jesus, and the one says to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, this day you will be with me in paradise." And so you have this understanding, like in the book of Revelation, that you have John who's seeing these things, that John is seeing all the saints gathered around the throne, rejoicing in the death of death. But yet, in our time, this hasn't come yet. And so John sees the heavenly realities of all this, the totality of everything taking place, and all the saints are living, and yet there's kind of this strange connection we have still with time, where it all hasn't totally came to fruition. It hasn't totally manifested itself. But understand that God is the God of the living. So that when Jesus says that we have the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, He's not the God of the dead. He's the God of the living. He's the one who gives life. And so that you understand that with Jesus in the Transfiguration, guess who they see? They see Elijah, who is living. They see Moses, who is living. Now, of course, Moses, we talk about in the Scripture how he died, and the Scripture records how Elijah was brought up in this whirlwind to heaven, kind of escaping the normal way of death in a very similar way to what we have the account of Enoch doing the same. But the point being that both Moses and Elijah are standing there living right before the eyes of Peter, James, and John on the Mount of Transfiguration. So your question and your comment about these assertions, I don't really know the context there, what people are saying, but I do know what the Scripture is saying. And so Jesus teaches us that God is the God of the living, and so the one who dies in Him, even though he dies, yet he lives. And so that's the wonderful news that we have in our baptism, that we are crucified with Christ, and we are also raised with Christ, and we right now currently are seated in the heavenly realm with Christ. But yet, it doesn't appear that way to us. So faith believes these promises of the heavenly reality that we cannot physically observe now, but by faith we walk in the promises of God, that it's a true reality, that we are already in heaven with God. So that the idea is that our soul, in essence, is already with God now as we walk on earth. We're just waiting for our body to catch up, and our body will catch up on the last day. And so when we put the body in the tomb, understand the whole hope in the bodily resurrection, that when we lay somebody to rest in the tomb in their body, we know that this is just like somebody going to sleep, that they're going to wake up, just like if you took a nap or if you took a rest for the evening and woke up the next morning, so that morning will come and we will all rise from the dead. But so again, understand the way that Jesus talks, the way the Scripture reveals to us that He's the God of the living.